January 1949. Café de Flore, Paris. The morning light filters through windows still bearing the ghost marks of wartime blackout tape, illuminating a woman hunched over a manuscript that will change how humanity thinks about half of itself. Simone de Beauvoir, 40 years old, sits surrounded by towers of paper, empty coffee cups, and the accumulated research of 3 years that have consumed her life and transformed her understanding of what it means to exist as a woman in the world. Her fingers, stained with ink and nicotine, trace across a sentence she has just written. One is not born, but rather becomes a woman. The words appear simple, almost obvious, yet they contain within them a philosophical revolution that will reverberate through decades of social change. She pauses, cigarette suspended between her lips, aware that she has articulated something that will make enemies of those who profit from women's subjugation and allies of those who have always sensed that their limitations were artificial rather than natural. This is not merely a writer finishing a book. This is the moment when one of the most influential works of the 20th century crystallizes in the mind of a woman who had spent 40 years learning to think of herself not as a woman who writes, but as a writer who happens to be a woman. The distinction, she now realizes, reveals everything about how society shapes consciousness and consciousness shapes possibility. The café bustles around her with the particular energy of post-war Paris intellectuals debating existentialism, resistance veterans sharing war stories, young people trying to build new lives from the rubble of old certainties. Yet Beauvoir writes in a bubble of concentration that has become her natural habitat. She has learned to think in public spaces, to maintain intellectual focus amid the chaos of lived experience, because thinking and living have never been separate activities for her. The Second Sex began as what she thought would be a brief essay about her personal experience of womanhood. 3 years later, it has become a comprehensive analysis of how every culture in human history has defined women as the other, the secondary sex, whose identity exists only in relation to man's primary existence. The research has taken her through anthropology, biology, psychology, literature, and philosophy, but more importantly, it has forced her to examine her own life with a clarity that is both liberating and devastating. She had always known she was different from other women of her generation and social class. While they planned marriages and children, she planned books and ideas. While they sought security through attachment to men, she sought independence through attachment to her own mind. While they accepted that biology was destiny, he insisted that consciousness was choice. But until writing this book, she had not understood that her individual rebellion was actually a response to universal oppression. The revelation was both personal and political. Every woman, she now understood, lived some version of the same struggle she had experienced. The struggle to exist as a subject rather than an object, as a consciousness rather than a body, as a human being rather than a category. Her privileged education and exceptional circumstances had not freed her from the fundamental condition of womanhood. They had simply given her the tools to analyze that condition with unprecedented clarity. Consider the impossibility of what she represents. A woman whose intellectual gifts were recognized and cultivated in a society that systematically denied such recognition to women. A philosopher who achieved independence in a culture that defined women through their dependence. A writer who found her voice by analyzing why women had been systematically silenced. Her very existence proved that women's supposed limitations were social constructions rather than biological facts. Yet achieving that existence had required her to transcend nearly every expectation her society held for women. The manuscript before her documents not just the oppression of women throughout history, but the psychological mechanisms through which that oppression becomes internalized, normalized, and even defended by its victims. She has discovered that the most effective forms of domination are those that convince the dominated that their subjugation is natural, inevitable, and even beneficial. But to understand how this philosophical revolutionary emerged from the daughter of a conventional bourgeois family, how a dutiful Catholic schoolgirl became one of the most radical thinkers of her generation, we must travel back to a nursery in Paris where a little girl first learned that being female meant being less than fully human and decided that such lessons were simply wrong. Simone Lucie Ernestine Marie Bertrand de Beauvoir was born on January 9, 1908, into a world that had already decided what her life should contain before she drew her first breath. As the daughter of Georges de Beauvoir, a legal secretary with aristocratic pretensions, and Françoise Brassard, a devoutly Catholic woman from a banking family, she inherited a set of contradictions that would shape both her rebellion and her philosophy. The Beauvoir household embodied the tensions of early 20th century French bourgeoisie, financially precarious despite their social aspirations, intellectually ambitious, yet culturally conservative, proud of their heritage, yet insecure about their future. These contradictions created an environment where young Simone learned early that the categories society used to organize human experience, class, gender, religion, family, were simultaneously powerful and arbitrary, meaningful and absurd. Her father, Georges, was a man caught between centuries, educated as a lawyer but working as a legal secretary due to financial constraints. He possessed the cultural sophistication of the old aristocracy without its economic foundation. He filled the household with books, introduced his daughters to literature and theater, and encouraged their intellectual development in ways that were unusual for fathers of his generation. Yet he also assumed that this intellectual cultivation was ornamental rather than professional, preparation for becoming cultivated wives rather than independent thinkers. Her mother, Françoise, represented the devout Catholic womanhood that still dominated French domestic life. Pious, self-sacrificing, devoted to family and faith, she embodied the very model of femininity that society held up as ideal. Yet young Simone observed that this ideal seemed to require the systematic denial of her mother's own intelligence, curiosity, and ambition. The woman who supervised her daughter's education was herself highly educated, yet had been taught that education's purpose for women was service to others rather than development of self. That between these two influences, a father who encouraged her mind while assuming it would serve conventional purposes, and a mother who demonstrated intelligence while denying its significance, Simone developed what would become her characteristic approach to analyzing social reality. The recognition that individual experience often contradicted social categories, and that these contradictions revealed the arbitrary nature of supposedly natural hierarchies. The Beauvoir family's financial struggles during Simone's childhood provided another crucial element in her intellectual formation. Unlike many of her bourgeois contemporaries who could afford to ignore economic reality, she learned early that independence required financial as well as intellectual resources. She watched her parents maintain social appearances while worrying constantly about money, observed how economic insecurity affected every family decision, and understood that women's dependence on marriage was often economic necessity disguised as romantic choice. This understanding would prove crucial to her later analysis of women's oppression. Unlike feminist thinkers who came from secure economic backgrounds and could focus primarily on political or cultural limitations, Beauvoir understood that women's subordination was reinforced by economic structures that made independence materially difficult as well as socially discouraged. Her childhood experience of watching intelligent women accept limitation because they had no viable alternatives would inform her insistence that liberation required material as well as ideological change. Education became her escape route, though initially she did not recognize it as such. The Institut Adeline d'Isseur, where she received her early schooling, was a prestigious Catholic institution that provided excellent academic training within a framework of conventional religious and social values. The school cultivated her intellectual abilities while attempting to channel them toward acceptable feminine purposes, teaching, perhaps, or educated motherhood, but certainly not independent philosophical or literary achievement. Yet the very excellence of her education contained the seeds of her rebellion. Learning Latin and Greek gave her access to classical texts that revealed alternative models of human possibility. Studying mathematics and science demonstrated that rational analysis could challenge received wisdom. Reading literature exposed her to characters both male and female who transcended conventional social roles through force of will and imagination. Most importantly, academic success gave her the first taste of what she would later recognize as authentic existence, the experience of developing and expressing her own capabilities, rather than simply conforming to external expectations. In the classroom, unlike in the domestic sphere, her intelligence was valued for its own sake, rather than for its utility to others. This contrast would become fundamental to her understanding of how social institutions either support or suppress human development. By adolescence, the contradictions in her environment had crystallized into a form of intellectual rebellion that would characterize her entire career. She continued to excel academically while increasingly questioning the religious and social authorities that governed her education. She maintained loving relationships with her parents while rejecting nearly everything they assumed about appropriate feminine behavior. She participated in family and social life, while privately developing a philosophical framework that would ultimately challenge the foundations of that life. The young woman preparing to enter university had already developed the intellectual courage that would define her mature work, the willingness to follow ideas wherever they led, regardless of their social or personal implications. She had learned to trust her own mind, even when it contradicted established authority, to value truth, even when it was uncomfortable, and to believe that understanding reality was more important than finding comfort. What she had not yet learned was that these intellectual qualities, which made her an exceptional student, would make her an impossible, conventional woman. The university years that lay ahead would force her to choose between the life her education had prepared her to live, and the life her intelligence demanded that she create. Chapter 1. Intellectual awakening. The Sorbonne in the 1920s was a world unto itself, a universe of ideas, where the most brilliant minds of a generation gathered to rebuild European intellectual life after the devastation of the Great War. For Simone de Beauvoir, entering this environment at age 18 was like discovering a country whose language she had been learning her entire life, without knowing such a place existed. Here, finally, was a community where intelligence mattered more than gender, where ideas were valued over appearances, where the quality of one's thinking determined one's social status. The contrast with her previous educational environment could not have been more dramatic. At the Institut Adeline d'Isère, intellectual achievement had been encouraged within strict boundaries. Excellent grades were praised as long as they did not lead to unfeminine ambitions. At the Sorbonne, intellectual achievement was the only currency that mattered. Students were judged by their ability to analyze Kant or interpret Dostoevsky, not by their adherence to social conventions or religious orthodoxy. For the first time in her life, Beauvoir found herself in an environment where being exceptionally intelligent was an advantage rather than a liability. Her fellow students valued her contributions to philosophical discussions, sought her opinions on literary questions, and treated her insights with the same seriousness they accorded to those of male colleagues. This experience of intellectual respect was intoxicating for someone who had grown accustomed to having her ideas valued only when they confirmed existing assumptions. The curriculum itself was revelatory. Philosophy at the Sorbonne was not the abstract academic exercise it had been in her religious education, but a living inquiry into the fundamental questions of human existence. How should one live? What constitutes authentic existence? What are the sources of meaning and value? These questions, which she had been pondering privately since childhood, were here the subject of rigorous collective investigation. Her professors introduced her to phenomenology, the philosophical movement that would become central to her mature thinking. The phenomenological approach examining consciousness as it actually operates rather than as theory suggests it should operate provided her with tools for analyzing her own experience with unprecedented precision. She began to understand that many of the limitations she had experienced as a woman might be the result of social conditioning rather than natural necessity. More revolutionary still was her encounter with existentialism, though the term had not yet been coined. The idea that existence precedes essence, that human beings exist first and create their identity through their choices and actions, rather than being born with predetermined nature, struck her as both obviously true and radically liberating. If human nature was not fixed, then women's supposed nature was not fixed either. If identity was created rather than discovered, then she could create an identity that had never existed before. The social environment of the university was equally transformative. For the first time, she formed friendships with young men who treated her as an intellectual equal rather than a potential romantic object or domestic companion. These relationships provided a model for how men and women might relate to each other as minds, rather than as representatives of their respective genders. The possibility of genuine intellectual companionship across gender lines was a revelation that would influence her approach to all future relationships. Yet even within this relatively liberated environment, she encountered the persistent reality of sexual discrimination. Female students were still rare enough to be noticed, still expected to prove themselves in ways that male students took for granted. Professors who praised her work sometimes coupled their praise with surprise that such insights could come from a woman. Fellow students who respected her intelligence sometimes assumed that her primary motivation for academic excellence was to attract a suitable husband. These experiences taught her something crucial about the nature of oppression, that it operates not only through direct prohibition, but through the more subtle mechanism of making exceptional achievement feel exceptional rather than normal. Even when women succeeded in traditionally male domains, their success was framed as unusual, remarkable, worthy of comment precisely because it violated expectations. This framing preserved the assumption that male achievement was natural while female achievement was extraordinary. The recognition of this dynamic led to one of her earliest philosophical insights, that liberation required not just the opportunity to succeed within existing structures, but the transformation of those structures so that female success became unremarkable. It was not enough for a few exceptional women to transcend social limitations. The limitations themselves needed to be recognized as artificial and eliminated. This insight was reinforced by her academic work, particularly her thesis on Leibniz, which required her to engage with centuries of philosophical thought produced almost entirely by men. She began to notice that the absence of women from intellectual history was not acknowledged as a problem requiring explanation, but simply accepted as natural. The philosophical tradition presented itself as universal human wisdom, yet it reflected the experience and perspectives of only half of humanity. Working within this tradition while recognizing its limitations became an intellectual challenge that would shape her entire career. She needed to master the tools of philosophical analysis that the tradition provided, while simultaneously questioning the assumptions on which that tradition was based. She had to become fluent in a language that had not been designed to express women's experience, while using that language to articulate insights that could only emerge from women's experience. The university years thus became a period of double education: formal education in the established intellectual disciplines, and informal education in the realities of being an exceptional woman in a world structured by and for exceptional men. Both forms of education were necessary preparation for the philosophical work that lay ahead, though neither was sufficient by itself. By the time she completed her degree, Beauvoir had developed the intellectual foundation that would support her mature work. A rigorous training in philosophical method combined with a clear understanding of how social structures shape consciousness, and consciousness shapes possibility. She had learned to think like a philosopher while remaining acutely aware of what it meant to exist as a woman philosopher in a world that regarded such combinations as inherently contradictory. Chapter 2. Meet Sartre, October 1929. The Col Normale supérieur. Two of France's most brilliant philosophy students encounter each other during the preparation for the agrégation, the prestigious competitive examination that would determine their academic futures. Simone de Beauvoir, 21, has already established herself as one of the most formidable intellects of her generation, known for her rigorous analytical abilities and her refusal to accept received wisdom without critical examination. Jean-Paul Sartre, 24, is equally brilliant, but in a different mode, wildly creative, philosophically adventurous, and convinced that traditional academic philosophy is far too limiting for the kind of thinking the modern world requires. Their first extended conversation takes place in the Luxembourg Gardens, where they debate questions that will occupy them for the next half-century. What constitutes authentic existence? How does consciousness relate to freedom? Can human beings transcend the circumstances into which they are born? What they discover is not just intellectual compatibility, but a form of mental collaboration that neither has experienced before. Here are two minds operating at the same level of intensity and sophistication, yet approaching philosophical questions from sufficiently different angles to make their exchanges genuinely illuminating rather than merely confirmatory. For Beauvoir, meeting Sartre represents the discovery of what she will later call the other consciousness, another mind powerful enough to challenge her own thinking while respecting the integrity of her intellectual development. Throughout her education, she has been the exceptional student, the one whose insights surprise professors and intimidate classmates. Now, she encounters someone whose intelligence matches her own while operating according to different principles, someone who can engage with her ideas at their full complexity while contributing insights she could not have reached independently. The attraction is primarily intellectual, though it quickly becomes personal as well. Sartre represents a model of intellectual existence that transcends conventional social categories. He seems to live entirely for ideas, to organize his life around philosophical inquiry rather than around the social expectations that still constrain even exceptional women. His dedication to thinking and writing is so complete that conventional markers of success, money, status, domestic comfort appear irrelevant to him. This is a form of freedom that Beauvoir recognizes as both appealing and dangerous. Dangerous, because Sartre's approach to existence challenges everything she has been taught about how life should be organized. He rejects marriage as an institution that compromises individual freedom, dismisses conventional career ambitions as distractions from authentic work, and insists that committed thinkers must be prepared to live outside the social structures that provide most people with security and identity. These ideas are exhilarating, but also terrifying for someone who has achieved success within conventional frameworks and understands the practical difficulties of life outside those frameworks. Their philosophical exchanges during this period reveal fundamental differences that will persist throughout their relationship. Sartre's approach to existentialism emphasizes radical freedom and individual responsibility, the idea that human beings are condemned to be free and must create their own values without reference to external authorities. Beauvoir finds this approach compelling but incomplete, recognizing that freedom operates differently for different people depending on their social circumstances. A woman's freedom, she intuited even then, is not simply a matter of individual choice, but is constrained by structures that limit women's choices while appearing to respect their autonomy. This difference in their understanding of freedom reflects their different social positions. Sartre, as a man from a bourgeois family with established intellectual credentials, can more easily imagine transcending social constraints through force of individual will. Beauvoir, despite her exceptional abilities, remains aware that her freedom depends partly on social changes beyond her individual control. This awareness will eventually lead to her more sophisticated analysis of how liberation requires both individual and collective transformation. Yet despite these philosophical differences, or perhaps because of them, their intellectual partnership becomes extraordinarily productive. Each pushes the other toward insights neither could reach independently. Sartre's emphasis on radical freedom challenges Beauvoir to think more boldly about transcending limitations. Beauvoir's attention to social constraints challenges Sartre to think more carefully about how structures shape consciousness and consciousness shapes possibility. The personal relationship that develops alongside their intellectual partnership is equally unprecedented. They create what they call a necessary love that allows for contingent loves, with others a primary emotional and intellectual bond that does not demand exclusivity in other relationships. This arrangement reflects their philosophical commitment to freedom while acknowledging their deep connection to each other. It also represents a radical experiment in how two independent consciousnesses might relate without either sacrificing autonomy to the relationship or sacrificing the relationship to autonomy. For Beauvoir, this relationship structure is particularly significant because it offers an alternative to the conventional choice between marriage and spinsterhood that faced women of her generation. She can maintain a deep connection with a man while preserving the independence that her intellectual work requires. She can experience love without accepting the subordination that romantic relationships traditionally imposed on women. Most importantly, she can continue developing as a philosopher without having to choose between her mind and her heart. The relationship also provides practical benefits that enable both their careers. They become each other's first readers, most serious critics, and most reliable supporters. Each knows that their work will receive careful attention from someone capable of appreciating its significance and identifying its weaknesses. This intellectual security allows them to take risks, experiment with ideas, and develop their thinking in directions that might seem professionally dangerous without such support. By 1930, when they both pass the aggregation Sartre first, Beauvoir second, a ranking that galls her, but which she recognizes as reflecting the examiner's bias rather than their relative abilities. They have established the partnership that will anchor both their lives and their work. They have created a relationship that allows each to remain an independent intellectual while sharing the fundamental project of understanding human existence and human possibility. What neither fully realizes yet is how this partnership will evolve as they encounter the practical challenges of building careers, navigating social expectations, and confronting the political upheavals that will define their generation. The intellectual foundation is solid, but the structure they build on that foundation will require constant negotiation and regular reconstruction as circumstances change and their understanding deepens. Chapter 3. Teaching and Writing, September 1931. Lick, E. Jeanne d'Arc, Rouen. At 23, Simone de Beauvoir begins her teaching career in a provincial town that feels like exile from the intellectual excitement of Paris. The position professor of philosophy at a prestigious girls' secondary school represents both achievement and limitation. She has succeeded in securing a position that will provide economic independence and intellectual respectability. Yet she finds herself once again in an environment where her capabilities must be channeled toward acceptable feminine purposes. Teaching philosophy to teenage girls in 1930s France means navigating complex social expectations about what young women should learn and how they should think. The curriculum emphasizes moral philosophy and classical texts, subjects deemed suitable for cultivating the refined sensibilities appropriate to educated wives and mothers. Yet Beauvoir's approach to these materials is anything but conventional. She encourages her students to question received wisdom, to examine their own experience critically, to think for themselves rather than simply absorbing the insights of male authorities. The classroom becomes her laboratory for testing ideas about consciousness, freedom, and social conditioning. Watching her students struggle with philosophical questions, she observes how cultural assumptions shape their thinking, even when they believe they are reasoning independently. Young women who demonstrate remarkable intellectual abilities in abstract discussions somehow accept without question the social arrangements that will limit their opportunities to use those abilities. This contradiction fascinates her and becomes the foundation for insights she will develop more fully in later work. Her teaching methods are revolutionary for their time and place. Rather than lecturing about philosophical systems, she engages students in Socratic dialogue that forces them to examine their own assumptions. Rather than presenting established truths, she teaches them to identify and analyze the premises underlying different philosophical positions. Most radically, she encourages them to apply philosophical analysis to their own lives, to examine critically the role society expects them to play. The response from students is electric. Many later describe her classes as transformative experiences that changed how they understood themselves and their possibilities. Here was a woman who demonstrated that intellectual achievement and feminine identity were not incompatible, who showed them that serious thinking about fundamental questions was not only possible for women, but necessary for anyone who wanted to live authentically. Yet the institutional response is more complicated. School administrators appreciate her students' obvious enthusiasm and their exceptional performance on examinations. However, they become concerned when some students begin questioning traditional assumptions about marriage, career, and women's roles. Parents complain that their daughters are developing unsuitable ambitions and asking uncomfortable questions about family arrangements. The tension between Beauvoir's effectiveness as a teacher and the subversive implications of her teaching creates ongoing conflict. These professional challenges force her to confront directly the political dimensions of education. She realizes that teaching is never politically neutral, that any approach to education either reinforces existing social arrangements or challenges them. Her commitment to teaching students to think critically inevitably leads some of them to critical conclusions about the society that has shaped their lives. This recognition deepens her understanding of how intellectual work relates to social change. During this period, she also begins her career as a writer. Her first novel, begun during evenings and weekends in Rouen, explores themes that will persist throughout her literary work: the conflict between social expectations and authentic self-development, the particular challenges faced by intelligent women, the relationship between personal freedom and social responsibility. Writing fiction provides an outlet for insights and observations that cannot be expressed within the constraints of philosophical discourse or classroom instruction. The writing process itself becomes a form of philosophical investigation. Through creating characters and situations, she explores possibilities that pure theoretical analysis cannot capture. How might a woman respond to discovering that her marriage is based on illusion? What happens when someone realizes that their entire social identity has been constructed by others? How do people create meaning when traditional sources of meaning prove inadequate? Fiction allows her to investigate these questions experientially rather than simply analytically. The dual career as teacher and writer creates a productive tension that enriches both activities. Teaching forces her to articulate complex ideas clearly and persuasively, skills that prove essential for effective writing. Writing allows her to explore ideas too radical or too personal for the classroom, then brings insights from that exploration back into her teaching. Students benefit from being taught by someone actively engaged in intellectual creation. Her writing benefits from engagement with young minds encountering philosophical questions for the first time. Yet managing both careers also creates practical challenges that illuminate the particular difficulties faced by women intellectuals. Unlike male colleagues who can assume that domestic responsibilities will be handled by wives, She must arrange her own life to accommodate the demands of both teaching and writing. Unlike male writers who can rely on women to provide emotional and practical support, she must create her own support systems while providing emotional labor to others. The relationship with Sartre becomes crucial during this period, though maintaining it across the distance between Rouen and Paris requires constant negotiation. They write letters almost daily, sharing ideas and impressions, continuing the philosophical dialogue that began during their student years. When possible, they meet for weekends and holidays, intensively discussing their work and planning future projects. The relationship provides intellectual stimulation and emotional support that enables both their careers, yet it also requires energy and attention that might otherwise go into their professional development. By 1935, when she secures a position in Paris and can end her provincial exile, Beauvoir has established herself as both an effective educator and a serious writer. More importantly, she has developed a clear understanding of how intellectual work relates to social change and personal authenticity. Teaching has shown her that ideas have practical consequences, that philosophical insights can transform individual lives and challenge social arrangements. Writing has provided tools for exploring possibilities that existing social arrangements do not accommodate. The provincial teaching years, initially experienced as frustrating limitation, proved to have been essential preparation for the major work that lies ahead. By working within traditional institutions while pursuing unconventional ideas, she has learned to navigate the gap between social expectations and intellectual integrity that will characterize her entire career. Chapter 4. War and Resistance. June 1940, Paris falls to Nazi Germany, and with it collapses the intellectual and social world that has nurtured Simone de Beauvoir's development. The cafés where she and Sartre debate philosophy close their doors to uncertain futures. The publishing houses that might have printed her work redirect their resources toward survival. The students who challenged her thinking disappear into the chaos of occupation, resistance, and collaboration. At 32, she confronts the collapse of everything she has assumed about civilization, progress, and the power of ideas to shape human possibility. The occupation forces her to confront questions that her philosophical education had addressed abstractly. What constitutes authentic action when all available choices are morally compromised? How does consciousness maintain its integrity under extreme external pressure? What responsibilities do intellectuals bear when their society faces existential crisis? These are no longer theoretical questions, but immediate practical dilemmas that will determine not only her physical survival, but her intellectual and moral identity. Initially, like many intellectuals, she responds to the occupation with the kind of stunned withdrawal. The speed and completeness of France's collapse challenges fundamental assumptions about European civilization and rational progress. If a society capable of producing Descartes, Voltaire, and Bergson could succumb so quickly to barbarism, what does this suggest about the relationship between intellectual achievement and moral progress? If the institutions that had supported philosophical inquiry could be so easily transformed into instruments of oppression, what was the value of philosophy itself? The personal impact is equally destabilizing. The life she has constructed teaching, writing, maintaining relationships, pursuing intellectual projects suddenly seems irrelevant to the fundamental question of physical survival. The independence she has fought to achieve becomes meaningless when independence itself is impossible under occupation. The freedom she and Sartre have celebrated as the foundation of authentic existence reveals its dependence on social conditions that can disappear overnight. Yet gradually, the crisis becomes a source of philosophical insight rather than simply intellectual paralysis. The extreme circumstances of occupation strip away social conventions and reveal what Beauvoir will later recognize as the fundamental structure of human existence: the requirement to choose and act despite uncertainty, to create meaning despite absurdity, to maintain dignity despite overwhelming forces beyond individual control. The war becomes an existential education that no classroom could provide. Her response evolves from passive resistance to active engagement. Initially, this means small acts of defiance, refusing to alter her behavior to accommodate German authorities, maintaining friendships with Jewish colleagues despite official pressure, continuing to teach and write as if intellectual life remained important. These gestures might seem trivial, but they represent a crucial philosophical stance: the insistence that consciousness can maintain its integrity even when external circumstances make such integrity dangerous. The decision to join active resistance comes gradually, emerging from recognition that philosophical neutrality is impossible when the fundamental conditions of human existence are under attack. The resistance offers her something she has never experienced before: the opportunity to translate philosophical insights into direct political action, to test theoretical commitments against practical consequences. The woman who has spent years analyzing consciousness and freedom in abstract terms now encounters them as matters of life and death. Working with the resistance teaches her lessons about solidarity, courage, and collective action that individual philosophical reflection could not provide. She discovers that authentic existence sometimes requires abandoning the personal projects that define individual identity in favor of collective efforts whose outcomes remain uncertain. She learns that freedom often depends on the willingness to risk the very consciousness that makes freedom possible. Most importantly, she experiences how shared commitment to values larger than individual self-interest can create forms of meaning that purely personal achievement cannot match. The experience also reveals the gendered dimensions of resistance work. Women in the resistance often perform different roles than men, carrying messages, providing safe houses, gathering intelligence, work that is equally dangerous but less officially recognized. Beauvoir observes how female resistors are forced to navigate not only the dangers of opposing occupation, but the additional challenge of operating within resistance organizations that often reproduce the gender hierarchies of the society they oppose. These observations contribute to her growing awareness that women's oppression operates through multiple systems simultaneously. Even within movements dedicated to liberation, women find their contributions undervalued, their leadership questioned, their capabilities assumed to be limited to traditional feminine roles. This recognition will become crucial to her later analysis of how women's liberation requires not just legal and political change, but transformation of the unconscious assumptions that shape all social relationships. The intellectual work of this period reflects these wartime insights. Writing becomes more than personal expression or even philosophical investigation. It becomes a form of resistance against forces that seek to deny the value of human consciousness and human dignity. Literature and philosophy are revealed as weapons in the struggle to maintain and develop whatever makes human life worth preserving. The novels she produces during and immediately after the war explore themes that emerge directly from her resistance experience: the moral complexity of choice under extreme circumstances, the relationship between individual authenticity and collective responsibility, the ways that external crisis can catalyze internal transformation. Characters face dilemmas similar to those she has confronted personally: how to maintain integrity while adapting to impossible circumstances, how to balance competing loyalties, how to create meaning when traditional sources of meaning have been destroyed. By 1945, when liberation finally comes, Beauvoir has been transformed by experiences that no amount of theoretical study could have provided. The woman who entered the war as a promising intellectual emerges as a mature philosopher whose insights have been tested against the most extreme circumstances human beings can face. She has learned that consciousness is both more fragile and more resilient than philosophy suggests, that freedom is both more constrained and more absolute than theory implies, that authentic existence requires forms of courage that can only be developed through engagement with practical challenges. Most importantly, she has discovered that intellectual work gains meaning and power when it connects with collective struggles for human dignity and possibility. The war years prepare her for the major works that will follow: analyses of human existence that combine philosophical rigor with political commitment, theoretical insight with practical wisdom, individual reflection with collective vision. Existentialist fame. Liberation brings with it an unexpected phenomenon: the emergence of existentialism as not just a philosophical movement, but a cultural sensation that transforms Simone de Beauvoir from an obscure provincial teacher into one of the most recognizable intellectuals in Europe. The cafés of Saint-Germain-des-Prés become pilgrimage destinations for young people seeking authentic existence in the ruins of conventional morality. Jazz clubs echo with discussions of freedom, responsibility, and authentic choice. Fashion magazines write articles about existentialist style. Suddenly, philosophy has become fashionable, and Beauvoir finds herself at the center of a cultural revolution she never intended to create. The irony is not lost on her. A philosophical movement dedicated to individual authenticity and resistance to social conformity has become the latest form of social conformity. Young people who adopt existentialist attitudes and appearance often seem to understand neither the philosophical foundations nor the practical implications of the ideas they claim to embrace. The serious philosophical work she and Sartre have developed over decades becomes simplified into slogans and poses that may actually prevent the kind of serious self-examination that authentic existence requires. Yet the popular success of existentialism also provides unprecedented opportunities. For the first time in history, a significant portion of the educated public is genuinely interested in fundamental philosophical questions. People are reading serious works of philosophy, attending philosophical lectures, engaging in discussions about consciousness, freedom, and responsibility. The cultural moment creates space for intellectual work that might otherwise remain confined to academic circles. Beauvoir's novels from this period capitalize on this cultural interest while maintaining serious philosophical content. The Blood of Others, published in 1945, uses the framework of wartime resistance to explore questions about individual responsibility and collective action that speak directly to readers trying to understand their own complicity in recent historical catastrophes. All Men Are Mortal, published in 1946, examines the relationship between individual mortality and historical meaning in ways that resonate with a generation traumatized by unprecedented destruction. The success of these novels establishes her as a significant literary voice independent of her relationship with Sartre. Critics recognize her distinctive approach to existentialist themes, less abstract than Sartre's treatment, more attentive to the practical challenges of implementing philosophical insights in concrete social circumstances. Her characters face recognizably human dilemmas while embodying universal philosophical principles. Her narratives explore how consciousness operates in specific historical situations while illuminating general features of human existence. More importantly, her literary success provides the economic independence that enables her to undertake the research project that will become the second sex. Unlike academic philosophers who must focus their research on topics deemed professionally respectable, she can afford to investigate questions that interest her personally even if they seem peripheral to mainstream philosophical concerns. The financial security from her novels allows her to spend 3 years investigating the situation of women throughout history without needing to justify this work to professional authorities who might not understand its significance. The celebrity status that comes with existentialist fame creates new challenges, as well as new opportunities. She becomes a public figure whose personal life attracts as much attention as her intellectual work. Journalists want to know about her relationship with Sartre, her views on marriage and family, her daily habits and personal relationships. The woman who has spent years analyzing how social roles constrain authentic self-development finds herself subjected to public scrutiny that threatens to reduce her to a set of social roles. Sartre's companion, the woman existentialist, the intellectual who rejects conventional femininity. Managing this public attention requires skills that her philosophical education did not provide. She must learn to present complex ideas in ways that general audiences can understand without oversimplifying them beyond recognition. She must respond to criticism that often misrepresents her positions while maintaining the intellectual integrity that makes her work valuable. Most challengingly, she must navigate the gap between her public image and her private reality, between what the public wants her to represent and what her actual intellectual and personal development requires. The international dimension of existentialist fame proves particularly significant for her intellectual development. Travel to other countries, lectures at foreign universities, and correspondence with intellectuals around the world expose her to different cultural approaches to questions she has been examining, primarily within French contexts. She begins to understand that many of the limitations she has analyzed as universal features of women's condition may actually be specific to particular social and cultural arrangements. This international perspective becomes crucial to the research for the second sex. Rather than assuming that French patterns of gender relations represent universal truths about male and female nature, she begins investigating how different societies organize relationships between men and women. The cross-cultural research reveals that practices she had taken for granted as natural are actually historical developments that vary significantly across cultures and time periods. The fame also provides access to intellectual resources that would not otherwise have been available. Publishers are willing to fund extensive research projects. Libraries provide special access to rare materials. Scholars in various fields share their expertise with someone whose work has achieved general recognition. The practical advantages of celebrity enable intellectual work that individual achievement alone could not support. Yet perhaps the most significant impact of this period is the recognition that intellectual work can have practical social consequences. The popular interest in existentialism demonstrates that serious philosophical ideas can influence how people understand themselves and their possibilities. This recognition increases both the opportunities and the responsibilities associated with intellectual work. If ideas have power to shape consciousness and consciousness shapes possibility, then philosophical work becomes a form of practical intervention in human affairs. By 1947, as she begins the serious research for The Second Sex, Beauvoir has learned to use public attention as a platform for intellectual work rather than allowing it to become a distraction from that work. She has discovered how to maintain serious philosophical investigation while engaging with broader cultural conversations. Most importantly, she has developed confidence that her particular insights and approaches have value not just as personal expressions, but as contributions to collective human understanding. Chapter 6. The Second Sex Research. January 1947. Bibliothèque Nationale, Paris. Surrounded by towers of books on anthropology, biology, psychology, history, and literature, Simone de Beauvoir begins the research that will consume the next 3 years of her life and produce one of the most influential works of the 20th century. What began as a modest project to examine her own experience as a woman has evolved into an ambitious attempt to understand how every human society has organized relationships between the sexes, and what these arrangements reveal about the nature of consciousness, power, and possibility. The scope of the investigation reflects her training in philosophical analysis combined with insights gained from wartime experience about how theory relates to practical circumstances. Rather than simply analyzing abstract concepts of gender or examining her personal situation, she decides to investigate the entire range of human experience to understand why women have been systematically subordinated across different cultures and historical periods. The research will require her to master fields far beyond her philosophical specialization: biological sciences, archaeological evidence, anthropological studies, psychological theory, economic analysis, literary criticism, and historical documentation. The early weeks of research prove both exhilarating and overwhelming. Each discipline she investigates reveals new dimensions of women's situation while raising additional questions that require further investigation. Biological research forces her to examine claims about natural differences between men and women, but the more she reads, the more clearly she sees how cultural assumptions shape scientific interpretation of biological evidence. Anthropological studies reveal extraordinary diversity in how different societies organize gender relations, but this diversity makes it impossible to identify universal patterns that could explain women's subordination as natural or inevitable. The psychological literature proves particularly fascinating and frustrating. Male psychologists from Freud onward have developed elaborate theories about female psychology, but these theories seem to reflect the psychologist's cultural assumptions more than careful observation of women's actual experience. When women psychologists challenge these theories, their challenges are often dismissed as evidence of the very pathology the theories claim to describe. The circular reasoning reveals how intellectual authority can become a tool for maintaining social arrangements rather than understanding them. Historical research provides the most extensive documentation of women's subordination, but it also reveals how consistently this subordination has been justified through appeals to nature, divine will, or social necessity. Each historical period produces new rationales for limiting women's opportunities while maintaining essentially the same patterns of exclusion. The persistence of these patterns across different religious, political, and economic systems suggests that women's oppression serves functions that transcend any particular cultural arrangement. Literary analysis proves unexpectedly illuminating. The representation of women in literature reveals how each culture imagines female possibility and limitation. Yet these representations often tell more about male fantasies and anxieties than about women's actual experience. Women appear in literature primarily as objects of male desire, obstacles to male achievement, or symbols of abstract virtues and vices, rather than as subjects with their own consciousness and agency. The absence of women's own literary voices from most historical periods makes it difficult to know how women understood their own situation. The most challenging aspect of the research involves synthesizing insights from all these different fields into a coherent analysis. Each discipline operates according to different methodological assumptions and standards of evidence. Biological claims about sex differences cannot be directly compared with anthropological observations about cultural practices or psychological theories about unconscious motivation. Yet all these different types of evidence must be integrated to develop a comprehensive understanding of women's situation. The research process itself becomes a form of philosophical education. Working across multiple disciplines teaches her that no single analytical approach provides adequate tools for understanding complex social phenomena. The philosophical training that emphasized logical rigor and conceptual clarity must be supplemented with empirical investigation, cross-cultural comparison, and historical analysis. Pure theoretical reflection, however sophisticated, cannot substitute for careful examination of how abstract principles operate in concrete circumstances. More personally, the research forces her to examine her own life and relationships with unprecedented honesty. Insights about how women's consciousness is shaped by social expectations require her to analyze how her own thinking has been influenced by assumptions she had never questioned. Discoveries about how women's achievements are systematically minimized force her to reconsider her own career trajectory and the compromises she has made to achieve recognition within male-dominated institutions. The relationship with Sartre comes under particular scrutiny during this period. Their arrangement, which she had understood as a freely chosen alternative to conventional marriage, begins to appear more complicated when examined through the analytical framework she is developing. How much of their relationship structure reflects genuine mutual choice, and how much reflects social pressures that make conventional options impossible for women with intellectual ambitions? How much does their partnership support her independent development, and how much does it subtly reproduce patterns of female dependence, despite its unconventional form? These personal insights become integrated into the larger intellectual project, without compromising its scholarly objectivity. The research benefits from her willingness to examine her own experience critically, but the analysis transcends personal revelation to address universal features of women's situation. Her individual story becomes significant not because it is unique, but because it illustrates patterns that affect all women, regardless of their particular circumstances or achievements. By late 1948, as the research phase nears completion, she has assembled what amounts to an encyclopedia of information about women's situation throughout history and across cultures. More importantly, she has developed an analytical framework that can explain the persistence of women's subordination without treating it as natural or inevitable. The framework combines insights from existentialist philosophy about consciousness and choice with empirical evidence about how social structures shape individual possibility. The synthesis reveals that women's oppression operates through multiple mechanisms simultaneously: economic arrangements that make independence difficult, legal structures that deny women equal status, cultural representations that define women as fundamentally different from and inferior to men, psychological processes that lead women to internalize limiting beliefs about their own capabilities. Most insidiously, these mechanisms operate in ways that make women's limitation appear to result from their own choices, rather than from systematic constraint. The research phase concludes with the recognition that women's liberation will require more than legal or political reform. Because women's oppression operates at the level of consciousness itself, liberation must involve transformation of how both women and men understand gender, identity, and possibility. This insight will shape the writing of The Second Sex and establish it as a work that challenges not just specific discriminatory practices, but the fundamental categories through which societies organize human experience. Chapter 9. Travel and Discovery. The success and controversy surrounding The Second Sex transforms Simone de Beauvoir from a French intellectual into an international figure whose insights about consciousness, freedom, and social change resonate with audiences around the world. Beginning in the early 1950s, she embarks on a series of journeys that provide opportunities to test her theoretical insights against different cultural realities, while expanding her understanding of how gender relations operate within various political and economic systems. The first major journey takes her to the United States in 1947, before the publication of The Second Sex, but during its composition. America in the post-war period represents a fascinating paradox for someone investigating women's situation. A society that officially celebrates individual freedom and equality while maintaining gender arrangements that strictly limit women's possibilities. American women have more legal rights and economic opportunities than their European counterparts, yet they seem more psychologically constrained by expectations about feminine behavior and domestic responsibility. Her observations of American suburban life prove particularly illuminating. The suburban housewife, celebrated in American popular culture as the epitome of feminine fulfillment, appears to Beauvoir as an example of how women's oppression can be maintained through apparent privilege. These women live in material comfort unknown to most of the world's population, yet their lives seem intellectually and emotionally impoverished. They have been educated to develop their minds, then placed in situations where mental development appears irrelevant to daily life. The American trip also provides her first extensive exposure to racial inequality as a system of social organization. Observing how American society maintains racial hierarchy while proclaiming equality helps her understand how dominant groups preserve their advantages by defining subordinate groups as naturally different and inferior. The parallels between racial and gender oppression become a crucial component of her evolving analysis of how consciousness is shaped by social structures. Travel to other countries during the 1950s and 1960 seconds reinforces and complicates her understanding of women's situation. Visits to Latin America reveal how economic development affects gender relations in complex ways, providing new opportunities for some women while reinforcing traditional arrangements for others. Trips to Asia expose her to cultures with fundamentally different concepts of individual identity and social organization, forcing her to question whether insights developed within European contexts apply universally. The journey to China in 1955 proves particularly significant for her political and intellectual development. Here, she encounters a society attempting to restructure gender relations as part of comprehensive social transformation. Chinese women have been granted formal equality within socialist economic arrangements, yet traditional attitudes about family and sexuality persist despite official ideology. The gap between revolutionary intentions and social reality provides lessons about how deeply cultural attitudes penetrate consciousness and resist change, even when supported by political power. These international experiences force her to revise and extend analysis from The Second Sex. The original work had focused primarily on how women's situation developed within European cultural traditions. Travel reveals that while women's subordination appears universal, the specific mechanisms through which it operates vary significantly across cultures. Economic arrangements that oppress women in one context may liberate them in another. Cultural practices that restrict female development in one society may support it elsewhere. The discoveries lead to important modifications in her theoretical framework. Rather than treating women's oppression as a single phenomenon with uniform causes, she begins to understand it as a complex system that adapts to different historical and cultural circumstances while maintaining essential patterns of male dominance and female subordination. This recognition makes her analysis more sophisticated while also making solutions appear more complicated. Travel also provides practical education about how ideas cross cultural boundaries and get translated into different intellectual and political contexts. Her work is received differently in various countries depending on local conditions, existing women's movements, and dominant political ideologies. American readers focus on psychological analysis and individual liberation. European audiences emphasize philosophical implications and cultural criticism. Third world intellectuals examine connections between gender oppression and economic exploitation. These different receptions teach her about the relationship between intellectual work and social change. Ideas do not simply transfer from one context to another, but must be adapted to local conditions and integrated with ongoing political struggles. The same analytical framework may support different practical programs depending on specific historical circumstances. Intellectual influence requires not just theoretical sophistication, but sensitivity to how abstract insights connect with concrete problems. The travel experiences also affect her personal development in ways that influence her intellectual work. Extended periods away from familiar environments and relationships force her to examine her own identity with new clarity. She discovers aspects of herself that only emerge when removed from social contexts that have shaped her self-understanding. The woman who had defined herself primarily through intellectual achievement learns to appreciate other dimensions of human experience. Most significantly, travel provides emotional and experiential education that complements her theoretical investigations. Reading about different cultures and corresponding with international intellectuals cannot substitute for direct encounter with alternative ways of organizing human experience. Travel makes abstract insights concrete, while revealing complexities that theoretical analysis alone cannot capture. The international perspective gained through travel becomes increasingly important as she develops her later work. Rather than remaining a specifically French or European intellectual, she begins to think about human liberation in global terms. Questions about women's situation connect with broader issues of economic justice, political freedom, and cultural development that affect all oppressed populations. Gender analysis becomes part of a comprehensive approach to understanding and challenging systematic inequality. By the late 1960s, her travel experiences have transformed her from an analyst of women's situation within particular cultural contexts into a theorist of human liberation whose insights transcend national and cultural boundaries. The intellectual development that began with personal rebellion against provincial limitations has evolved into global vision that connects individual consciousness with social transformation on an international scale. Chapter 10. Age and Reflection. The 1960s bring Simone de Beauvoir face to face with the subject that feminist theory has largely ignored, but that becomes increasingly urgent in her own life. The experience of aging as a woman in a society that defines women's value primarily through youth, beauty, and reproductive capacity. At 55, she confronts the reality that the body which has carried her consciousness through nearly 6 decades of intellectual and emotional development is beginning to show signs of physical decline. For someone whose philosophy emphasizes the unity of consciousness and embodied existence, aging presents theoretical as well as personal challenges. Her initial response to aging reflects the denial that characterizes most people's early encounters with physical limitation. Despite her philosophical commitment to accepting reality as it is rather than as she wishes it to be, she finds herself attempting to maintain the physical appearance and capabilities of her earlier years. The woman who had criticized other women for their obsession with beauty discovers herself spending increasing time and energy on clothing, cosmetics, and health regimens designed to preserve a youthful appearance. Yet this personal struggle with aging becomes the foundation for another groundbreaking analytical project. Just as her investigation of women's situation had emerged from examining her own experience as a woman, her study of aging emerges from honest reflection on what it means to grow older in a society that treats aging as failure rather than natural development. The Coming of Age, published in 1970, represents her attempt to apply the same analytical rigor to aging that she had brought to gender analysis. The research for this work requires her to examine biological, psychological, anthropological, and historical evidence about how different societies organize the experience of aging. The investigation reveals that attitudes toward old age vary dramatically across cultures and historical periods, suggesting that current Western assumptions about aging reflect social arrangements rather than natural facts. Societies that value wisdom and experience treat aging differently than societies that prioritize productivity and physical capability. The analysis also reveals how aging affects men and women differently within patriarchal social arrangements. While both sexes experience physical decline, women face the additional burden of losing social value as they lose reproductive capacity and youthful appearance. Men may gain authority and respect with age. Women typically find their social importance diminishing precisely when their experience and wisdom are greatest. This gender analysis of aging leads to insights that extend her earlier feminist theory. She recognizes that women's oppression operates differently at different life stages, and that liberation must address the full range of female experience. Rather than focusing primarily on young women's struggles with education, career, and family formation, older women face distinctive challenges that require specific theoretical analysis and practical responses. The personal dimension of aging research forces her to examine her own relationships with new honesty. The arrangement with Sartre, which had provided intellectual and emotional support for decades, becomes more complicated as both age and develop different physical and psychological needs. Their agreement to maintain independence while sharing a primary emotional bond works differently when independence requires increasing practical support, and when the future contains clear limitations rather than unlimited possibilities. She also confronts the reality that aging affects intellectual as well as physical capabilities. While her mental acuity remains strong, she notices changes in energy, concentration, and creative capacity that force her to adjust her working methods and goals. The woman who had previously approached intellectual projects with confidence that time and effort would eventually yield desired results must now work within acknowledged limitations. Yet aging also provides unexpected gifts that enrich her intellectual and personal development. Freedom from reproductive concerns and social expectations about female behavior creates space for forms of self-exploration that were not possible earlier. Reduced investment in future achievements allows greater appreciation for present experience. The proximity of death gives urgency and clarity to questions about meaning and value that can be avoided when life seems infinite. The aging research also connects with her growing political involvement in causes that extend beyond women's rights. The recognition that aging is another form of systematic social oppression leads her to support movements advocating for older people's rights and dignity. The insights about how societies organize different life stages inform her analysis of other forms of inequality and discrimination. During this period, she also becomes involved in political activities that apply her intellectual insights to practical social problems. The student protests of 1968 provide opportunities to support young people challenging established authority. The emerging women's liberation movement allows her to contribute theoretical foundation to political activism. Her participation in protests against the Vietnam War connects her feminist analysis with broader questions about power, violence, and social change. These political activities teach her about the relationship between intellectual work and practical activism in ways that pure theoretical reflection could not provide. She learns how abstract insights must be translated into concrete programs, how theoretical analysis must be adapted to political realities, how individual development connects with collective liberation. The integration of intellectual and activist commitments becomes a crucial component of her mature philosophical approach. The later writings of this period reflect her growing understanding of how personal development, social analysis, and political commitment can be integrated into a coherent approach to human existence. Rather than treating philosophy, literature, and activism as separate activities, she develops methods that allow each to inform and enrich the others. Intellectual work becomes more practical. Political activity becomes more thoughtful. Personal development becomes more socially conscious. By the early 1970s, she has established herself not just as a theorist of women's liberation, but as a comprehensive thinker whose insights address fundamental questions about human development, social change, and individual authenticity. The young woman who had rebelled against provincial limitations has become an elder whose influence extends globally and whose ideas continue to evolve in response to new experiences and changing social conditions. Chapter 11. Feminist Activism, May 1968. The streets of Paris explode with student protests, worker strikes, and calls for revolutionary transformation that challenge every established institution in French society. Simone de Beauvoir, now 60 years old, finds herself in the unexpected position of being both a respected elder of the intellectual establishment and a symbol of rebellion for young women discovering feminist consciousness. The theoretical analysis she had developed in The Second Sex suddenly becomes practical program for activists demanding immediate social change. The emergence of the women's liberation movement (MLF) in France provides her first opportunity to observe how her intellectual work translates into collective political action. Young women who have read The Second Sex in university courses now organize consciousness-raising groups, demonstrate for reproductive rights, and challenge sexist practices in their personal and professional lives. They want her to serve not just as intellectual inspiration, but as active participant in their political struggles. Initially, her response to the movement is ambivalent. On one hand, she is gratified to see that her analysis has contributed to collective action rather than remaining merely academic exercise. The fact that women are using her insights to challenge their own oppression proves that intellectual work can have practical social consequences. On the other hand, she is uncomfortable with the role of feminist guru that some activists want her to play. Her commitment to individual authenticity makes her suspicious of movements that might substitute collective ideology for independent thinking. The tension is resolved through her decision to participate selectively in activist causes while maintaining intellectual independence from any particular political organization or ideological position. She signs manifestos supporting women's rights, participates in demonstrations for reproductive freedom, and contributes money to feminist organizations. Yet she also continues to develop her theoretical work according to her own intellectual priorities rather than political demands. The most significant activist commitment involves her participation in the campaign to legalize abortion in France. In 1971, she joins 342 prominent women in signing a manifesto declaring that they have had illegal abortions and demanding that the procedure be legalized. The Manifesto of the 343, as it becomes known, represents unprecedented public challenge to laws that criminalize reproductive choice while forcing women to seek dangerous illegal procedures. The abortion campaign connects her feminist analysis with immediate practical consequences for women's lives. Her theoretical insight that women's liberation requires control over reproduction becomes translated into specific legal and political demands. The campaign also demonstrates how intellectual analysis can provide foundation for political activism, while activism provides concrete focus for theoretical insights. Her involvement in the abortion campaign teaches her important lessons about the relationship between individual courage and collective action. Signing the manifesto requires her to take public risks that could affect her career and reputation. Yet the collective nature of the action makes individual risk-taking both safer and more effective than isolated protest. The experience reinforces her understanding that liberation requires both personal authenticity and social solidarity. The feminist movement also provides opportunities to develop her analysis of how consciousness raising operates as both psychological and political process. Participating in women's groups allows her to observe how individual women discover that their personal problems reflect social patterns rather than individual failings. She watches women develop feminist consciousness through examining their own experience collectively rather than privately. These observations contribute to her evolving understanding of how social change occurs. Rather than resulting simply from intellectual analysis or political organizing, innovation appears to require integration of personal development with collective action. Women must understand their individual situation differently while also working together to change the social conditions that shape individual possibilities. The international dimension of feminist activism during this period provides additional opportunities for testing and developing her theoretical insights. Correspondence with feminist activists in other countries reveals how women's liberation movements adapt to different cultural and political circumstances while addressing similar fundamental issues. American feminists focus on legal equality and economic opportunity. European feminists emphasize cultural transformation and political revolution. Third world feminists connect gender oppression with economic exploitation and cultural imperialism. These international connections deepen her understanding of how gender oppression intersects with other forms of systematic inequality. Rather than treating women's liberation as a separate issue, she begins to see it as a component of comprehensive challenge to hierarchical social arrangements. Feminist analysis becomes part of broader revolutionary program rather than narrow special interest. Her participation in feminist activism also affects her personal relationships in ways that require ongoing negotiation. The woman who had achieved independence through exceptional individual circumstances must now consider how her choices appear to other women facing similar challenges with fewer resources. The relationship with Sartre, which had provided personal liberation within patriarchal social arrangements, must be evaluated through feminist analysis that questions whether individual solutions can be authentic when systematic problems remain unaddressed. The aging dimension of feminist activism becomes increasingly important as she recognizes that women's liberation movements often focus primarily on young women's concerns, while ignoring issues that affect older women. Her involvement helps ensure that feminist analysis addresses the full range of women's life experience, rather than treating liberation as relevant only to certain age groups or life stages. By the mid-1970s, her integration of intellectual work with political activism has created a model for how theory and practice can inform each other without either compromising intellectual integrity or reducing political effectiveness. She demonstrates how established intellectuals can contribute to social movements while continuing to develop their scholarly work according to their own priorities and standards. The activist period also confirms her long-standing belief that authentic existence requires engagement with collective struggles for human liberation, rather than withdrawal into purely personal development. Individual authenticity and social responsibility are not competing values, but complementary aspects of mature human development. The woman who had begun her career seeking personal liberation through intellectual achievement discovers that such liberation is incomplete without commitment to collective liberation. Chapter 12. Later works and memoirs. The 1970s and 1980 seconds witnessed Simone de Beauvoir's transformation from active theorist to reflective chronicler as she undertakes the monumental task of documenting not only her own intellectual and personal development, but the entire cultural transformation she has both witnessed and helped to create. The decision to write comprehensive memoirs reflects her recognition that individual experience, honestly examined and skillfully presented, can illuminate historical processes that remain invisible when viewed only from statistical or theoretical perspectives. The Prime of Life, published in 1960, had already established her as a master of autobiographical writing, capable of transforming personal narrative into social analysis. The later volumes of her autobiography, Force of Circumstance, 1963, and All Said and Done, 1972, extend this project by examining how individual consciousness develops through engagement with historical events and cultural change. The memoirs document not just her personal journey, but the evolution of an entire intellectual generation that has lived through depression, war, liberation, and revolutionary transformation. The autobiographical project requires her to examine her own life with the same analytical rigor she had brought to investigating women's situation and aging. This self-examination proves more difficult than analyzing external social phenomena because it requires her to acknowledge mistakes, limitations, and contradictions in her own development. The woman who had built her career on intellectual honesty must now apply that honesty to evaluating her own choices and their consequences. The relationship with Sartre comes under particularly careful scrutiny in the later memoirs. Their arrangement, which had seemed revolutionary in their youth, appears more complex when viewed from the perspective of decades of experience. She acknowledges benefits the relationship provided: intellectual companionship, emotional support, shared commitment to ideas, while also recognizing costs that were not apparent initially. The relationship enabled both their careers, while also constraining possibilities that might have emerged from different choices. The memoir writing process also forces her to confront the gap between her public image and private reality. The woman celebrated as a symbol of female liberation must acknowledge the ways her own liberation remained incomplete, the compromises she made with social expectations, the advantages she enjoyed that were not available to other women. This honest self-examination enhances rather than undermines her credibility as analyst of women's situation by demonstrating that even exceptional women remain subject to systematic constraints. During this same period, she undertakes another major theoretical project by examining how death affects human consciousness and social relationships. The Very Easy Death, published in 1964, chronicles her mother's dying process and explores how confronting mortality forces reconsideration of all assumptions about meaning, value, and relationship. The work continues her investigation of how consciousness operates under extreme circumstances while extending her analysis to experiences that affect everyone regardless of gender, class, or cultural background. The death study leads to broader philosophical reflection on how finite existence affects human possibility and meaning. Rather than treating mortality as simply biological fact or abstract philosophical concept, she examines how awareness of death shapes consciousness throughout life. The recognition that existence is limited makes choices more urgent, while also revealing that ultimate significance cannot depend on permanence or final achievement. This philosophical investigation of mortality connects with her ongoing analysis of aging and her increasing awareness of her own limitations. The intellectual work becomes simultaneously more urgent and more detached, as she recognizes that time for completing projects is finite, while also understanding that the value of intellectual work does not depend on personal survival. Ideas transcend individual consciousness while requiring individual consciousness for their development and transmission. The later memoirs also document her growing involvement with international intellectual and political networks that extend far beyond the Parisian existentialist circle where her career began. Correspondence and collaboration with thinkers around the world provide global perspective on questions that might otherwise remain culturally limited. The intellectual development that began with rebellion against provincial French bourgeoisie culminates in contributions to international conversations about consciousness, liberation, and social change. Yet the memoirs also reveal increasing awareness of the limitations and contradictions inherent in intellectual life itself. The woman who had dedicated her career to analyzing and challenging social arrangements must acknowledge that intellectual work, however radical in intention, often serves to preserve existing systems by providing symbolic alternatives to practical change. Critical analysis can become substitute for, rather than catalyst for, social transformation. This recognition leads to more modest claims about the relationship between intellectual work and social change, while also reinforcing her commitment to intellectual honesty. Ideas cannot guarantee liberation, but they can provide tools for people seeking liberation through their own efforts. Theoretical insights cannot substitute for political action, but they can inform action while helping activists understand the broader implications of their struggles. The memoir project concludes with All Said and Done, which attempts to assess the significance of a life dedicated to understanding and promoting human authenticity and liberation. The assessment is characteristically honest about both achievements and limitations. She has contributed to theoretical understanding of consciousness, freedom, and social change, while also participating in practical efforts to challenge oppressive arrangements. Yet, the fundamental problems she identified in her early work, systematic inequality, consciousness shaping social structures, the gap between human possibility and social reality persists despite decades of analysis and activism. The final volume acknowledges that individual intellectual work, however significant, cannot resolve contradictions that are built into the structure of social existence itself. Yet, the work retains value because it provides resources for each generation to understand its own situation and develop its own responses to persistent human challenges. The goal is not to solve problems permanently, but to contribute to ongoing human effort to create meaning, beauty, and justice within whatever circumstances exist. By completing the autobiographical project, Beauvoir has created something unprecedented in intellectual history, a comprehensive account of how one consciousness develops through engagement with the major intellectual and political movements of the 20th century. The memoirs document not just individual development, but the evolution of ideas, the relationship between personal experience and historical change, and the possibilities and limitations of intellectual life as a form of human engagement. Chapter 13: Final Years and Influence. The 1980s find Simone de Beauvoir in an unexpected role, that of living monument to intellectual courage and feminist vision, whose ideas have influenced a generation of scholars, activists, and ordinary people seeking to understand their own possibilities within changing social circumstances. At 75, she has achieved a form of cultural authority that transcends academic recognition or literary success. Her insights about consciousness, freedom, and social change have become part of the intellectual foundation upon which contemporary feminism, existentialism, and theories of liberation are built. Yet, this cultural authority also creates new challenges for someone whose philosophy emphasizes the danger of accepting any truth as final, or any authority as absolute. Young feminists who treat her work as scripture rather than starting point for their own investigations miss the essential message that authentic existence requires independent thinking rather than faithful adherence to established doctrine. The woman who had spent her career challenging intellectual authority finds herself in the uncomfortable position of representing the kind of authority she had always questioned. Her response to this dilemma reflects the intellectual integrity that has characterized her entire career. Rather than either embracing or rejecting the authority others want to attribute to her, she continues to develop her thinking in response to new experiences and changing social conditions. The final years become a period of ongoing intellectual growth rather than simple repetition of established insights. The emergence of new feminist movements during this period provides opportunities to test and extend her theoretical framework. Second-wave feminism had drawn heavily on her analysis of women as other and her insights about how consciousness is shaped by social arrangements. Third-wave feminism, emerging in the 1980s, raises questions about race, class, sexuality, and cultural difference that require more complex analysis than her original framework provided. These newer feminist insights force her to reconsider assumptions about universal female experience that had informed her earlier work. Her analysis had been based primarily on the situation of educated European and American women, yet feminists from other backgrounds reveal how gender oppression intersects with racial, economic, and cultural oppression in ways that create significantly different experience for different groups of women. The recognition that there is no single women's situation, but rather multiple situations shaped by various forms of systematic inequality, leads to more sophisticated, but also more complex theoretical framework. The international perspective becomes increasingly important during these final years as feminist movements develop in countries throughout the world. Her correspondence with feminist intellectuals and activists from Africa, Asia, and Latin America reveals how gender analysis must be adapted to different cultural contexts and historical circumstances. The insights developed within European philosophical traditions remain relevant, but require significant modification when applied to societies with different economic arrangements, religious traditions, and family structures. These international exchanges also deepen her understanding of how feminist analysis connects with other liberation movements. Rather than treating women's oppression as isolated phenomenon, she begins to see it as part of a comprehensive system of hierarchical domination that includes racial, economic, and cultural exploitation. This broader perspective influences her support for movements challenging imperialism, racism, and economic inequality, as well as gender oppression. The aging process itself becomes another source of theoretical insight during this period. Rather than simply accepting physical and mental decline as inevitable biological facts, she investigates how social attitudes toward aging affect the experience of growing older. Her own experience of maintaining intellectual activity, despite physical limitations, provides evidence that aging need not involve the intellectual and emotional deterioration that society often treats as natural. The death of Jean-Paul Sartre in 1980 marks a fundamental transition in her personal life that affects all other aspects of her existence. The relationship that had anchored her intellectual and emotional development for 50 years suddenly ends, requiring her to reconstruct her identity without the partnership that had been central to her self-understanding. The experience forces her to confront directly questions about individual authenticity, relationship, and mortality that had been theoretical concerns in her earlier work. Her response to Sartre's death demonstrates the philosophical maturity she has achieved through decades of applying existentialist insights to practical life challenges. Rather than either denying the loss or being overwhelmed by it, she accepts grief as appropriate response to the end of meaningful relationship, while also recognizing that her own existence must continue according to its own trajectory rather than being defined by what has ended. The memoir of their final years together, Adieu, A Farewell to Sartre, documents both the deterioration of his mental capabilities and her own struggle to maintain intellectual honesty while providing emotional support. The work examines how consciousness confronts its own limitations and mortality, while also exploring how relationships must adapt when fundamental changes make previous arrangements impossible. During her own final years, she becomes increasingly focused on questions about intellectual legacy and the relationship between individual achievement and historical continuity. Her ideas have influenced intellectual and political developments around the world, yet she recognizes that ideas remain vital only when they are adapted and extended by new generations rather than simply preserved as monuments to past insight. The final interviews and essays reveal her continued commitment to intellectual courage and social responsibility, combined with realistic assessment of what individual intellectual work can and cannot accomplish. She has contributed to human understanding of consciousness, freedom, and possibility, while remaining aware that such contributions are valuable only when they connect with ongoing human efforts to create meaning and dignity within whatever circumstances exist. When death comes in 1986, she has achieved something rare among intellectuals. Her ideas remain living resources for people seeking to understand their own situations rather than merely historical artifacts. Documenting past achievement, the integration of theoretical sophistication with practical wisdom, individual insight with social commitment, that characterized her mature work continues to provide guidance for people confronting the fundamental challenges of human existence. Chapter 14. Identity Transformed. The question of identity that had driven Simone de Beauvoir's entire intellectual journey, what does it mean to be a woman, to be a human being, to be an authentic self in a world that provides ready-made categories for existence, finds its most complete expression not in any single work, but in the cumulative effect of a life dedicated to demonstrating that identity is created rather than discovered, chosen rather than inherited, earned through action rather than given through birth. By the time of her death in 1986, Beauvoir had established something unprecedented in intellectual history, a body of work that combined rigorous philosophical analysis with sustained political commitment, theoretical sophistication with practical wisdom, individual insight with collective vision. More importantly, she had demonstrated through her own life that the insights she articulated could actually be lived, that the liberation she analyzed was not just abstract possibility, but achievable reality for anyone willing to undertake the difficult work of authentic self-creation. The transformation she underwent from dutiful bourgeois daughter to revolutionary feminist philosopher illustrates the central insight of her mature philosophy, that human beings are not trapped by the circumstances of their birth, but can transcend those circumstances through conscious choice and determined action. Yet her transformation also reveals the complexity of such transcendence, the ways that liberation requires not just individual courage, but social change. Not just personal insight, but collective struggle. Her early recognition that she was different from other girls of her generation had led initially to the assumption that her difference was personal rather than political. She thought she was unusual in wanting intellectual achievement, independence, and creative fulfillment rather than marriage, children, and domestic satisfaction. Only through years of investigation did she discover that her individual rebellion reflected systematic constraints that affected all women, regardless of their particular circumstances or capabilities. This discovery that personal problems are often political problems in disguise became one of her most influential contributions to feminist thought and practice. By connecting individual experience with social analysis, she provided tools for understanding how consciousness is shaped by social structures, while also demonstrating how changed consciousness can contribute to changing social structures. The personal became political through rigorous analysis, rather than simple assertion. The evolution of her relationship with Sartre illustrates another crucial dimension of her approach to identity transformation. Rather than simply rejecting conventional marriage in favor of complete independence, she created an alternative form of partnership that preserved individual autonomy while acknowledging the human need for deep connection. The arrangement required constant negotiation and regular reconstruction as both partners changed and circumstances evolved, but it proved that conventional social arrangements could be transcended without sacrificing either individual development or meaningful relationship. Yet her honest examination of this relationship in her later memoirs also reveals its limitations and costs. The partnership that enabled both their careers also constrained possibilities that might have emerged from different choices. The freedom they achieved was partial rather than complete, revolutionary in some respects but conservative in others. This acknowledgement enhances rather than undermines the value of their experiment by showing that even radical alternatives to conventional arrangements remain subject to human limitations and social pressures. The development of her feminist philosophy demonstrates how identity transformation requires not just personal insight, but collective analysis and action. Her investigation of women's situation revealed that individual liberation, however complete it might seem, remains vulnerable as long as systematic oppression continues to affect other women. Authentic existence requires engagement with collective struggles for liberation rather than withdrawal into purely personal development. This insight led to her increasing involvement with feminist activism during her later years. Despite her natural preference for intellectual work over political organizing, she recognized that the insights she had developed through individual reflection and research could contribute to collective efforts for social change, while participation in political movements could deepen and extend her theoretical understanding. The international dimension of her influence reveals how insights developed within particular cultural circumstances can transcend those circumstances when they address universal features of human existence. Her analysis of how consciousness is shaped by social arrangements, originally developed through examination of women's situation in European contexts, proved relevant to liberation movements throughout the world. The specific became universal through rigorous analysis rather than abstract generalization. Yet, the international reception of her work also reveals the limitations of any individual intellectual achievement. Ideas remain vital only when they are adapted and extended by new generations facing their own circumstances, rather than simply preserved as monuments to past insight. Her influence continues to grow precisely because feminists and other liberation movements have used her analysis as starting point for their own investigations, rather than final authority for their conclusions. The question of intellectual legacy becomes particularly complex for someone whose philosophy emphasizes the danger of treating any truth as final or any authority as absolute. She had spent her career challenging established intellectual authorities and encouraging readers to think for themselves rather than accepting expert opinion without critical examination. The greatest tribute to her work would be its creative extension and modification rather than faithful preservation. Her approach to aging and death demonstrates the practical implications of a philosophy based on authentic self-creation rather than conformity to social expectations. Rather than accepting conventional assumptions about appropriate behavior for older women, she continued developing her thinking and extending her commitments until the end of her life. Age brought limitations that required accommodation, but it did not require abandonment of the intellectual courage and social responsibility that had defined her authentic existence. The ultimate achievement of her career may be its demonstration that the choice between individual authenticity and social responsibility is false. Authentic existence requires engagement with collective struggles for human dignity and possibility, rather than withdrawal into purely personal development. Individual liberation remains incomplete and vulnerable as long as systematic oppression continues to constrain human development generally. By transforming herself from conventional bourgeois daughter into revolutionary intellectual while maintaining intellectual integrity and personal relationships, Beauvoir created a model of how individual development and social commitment can be integrated rather than requiring choice between them. The identity she constructed through conscious effort and determined action provides evidence that liberation is possible while also revealing that such liberation requires both personal courage and collective struggle. Her life thus becomes an argument for the central insight of existentialist philosophy, that human beings are responsible for creating their own identity through their choices and actions, rather than simply accepting identities provided by society. Yet, her achievement also demonstrates that such self-creation is not purely individual enterprise, but requires social conditions that support rather than constrain human development, and that creating such conditions requires collective effort as well as individual authenticity. Half a century after the publication of The Second Sex, Simone de Beauvoir's influence on global intellectual and political development continues to expand in directions she could not have anticipated, but that remain consistent with her fundamental insights about consciousness, freedom, and social change. What began as one woman's attempt to understand her own experience as a thinking being in a world organized by and for men has evolved into a comprehensive framework for analyzing how identity is created rather than given, how liberation requires both individual development and collective action, and how authentic existence depends on the courage to challenge established authority while taking responsibility for creating alternatives. The immediate feminist legacy is both profound and complex. Second-wave feminism drew heavily on her analysis of women as other, her insights about how gender identity is socially constructed rather than biologically determined, and her demonstration that personal problems often reflect political arrangements rather than individual failings. The consciousness-raising groups that became central to 1960s and 1972's feminism applied her methodology of examining individual experience collectively to discover social patterns that individual analysis alone could not reveal. Yet contemporary feminism has also revealed limitations in her original framework that require ongoing theoretical development. Her analysis was based primarily on the experience of educated European and American women. Yet feminists from other backgrounds have shown how gender oppression intersects with racial, economic, and cultural oppression in ways that create significantly different experiences for different groups of women. The recognition that there is no universal women's experience, but rather multiple experiences shaped by various forms of systematic inequality, has led to more sophisticated theoretical frameworks that extend rather than replace her original insights. The influence on contemporary gender theory has been equally significant, but more controversial. Her insight that gender identity is performed rather than given, that one becomes a woman through social interaction rather than biological development, anticipated theoretical developments that emerged decades later in feminist and queer theory. Contemporary discussions of gender fluidity, transgender identity, and the social construction of sexuality often draw on analytical frameworks she pioneered while extending them in directions that challenge some of her specific conclusions. The philosophical influence extends far beyond feminist theory into broader questions about identity, authenticity, and social change. Her integration of existentialist insights about individual freedom with social analysis of how structures constrain choice has influenced liberation movements throughout the world. Civil rights activists, anti-colonial movements, and campaigns for economic justice have found in her work theoretical tools for understanding how oppression operates through consciousness as well as external force. The methodological innovations may prove even more lasting than her specific theoretical conclusions. Her demonstration that rigorous philosophical analysis could be combined with interdisciplinary research, personal reflection, and political commitment created a model for intellectual work that transcends traditional academic boundaries. Contemporary fields like women's studies, African American studies, post-colonial theory, and queer studies follow methodological approaches she pioneered while applying them to different subjects and populations. The literary influence has been equally significant in transforming how personal experience gets represented in serious literature. Her autobiographical writings demonstrated that individual life stories could serve as vehicles for analyzing historical processes and social change, rather than simply providing personal testimony or aesthetic experience. The integration of philosophical insight with narrative development influenced generations of writers seeking to connect personal experience with broader intellectual and political questions. Educational applications continue to expand as her insights about how consciousness is shaped by social arrangements inform pedagogical approaches that emphasize critical thinking rather than passive absorption of established knowledge. Her demonstration that questioning authority is essential for intellectual development while remaining dangerous for people without economic and social resources has influenced educational programs designed to develop critical thinking skills while providing practical support for students challenging established arrangements. Therapeutic applications have emerged as mental health professionals recognize that many psychological problems reflect social arrangements rather than individual pathology. Her analysis of how gender socialization creates internal conflicts that appear to be personal failings has influenced approaches to therapy that address social as well as individual causes of psychological distress. The insight that authentic existence requires challenging rather than simply adapting to problematic social arrangements has become central to therapeutic approaches that emphasize empowerment rather than adjustment. The international influence has proved particularly significant, as liberation movements throughout the developing world have found in her analysis tools for understanding how colonialism, economic exploitation, and cultural domination operate through consciousness as well as political and economic force. Her insight that oppression succeeds by convincing the oppressed that their subordination is natural rather than imposed has informed anti-colonial movements, indigenous rights campaigns, and struggles for economic justice that connect individual consciousness with collective resistance. Contemporary political movements continue to draw on her insights about the relationship between individual authenticity and social change. Rather than treating personal development and political activism as competing activities, movements for racial justice, economic equality, and environmental protection often emphasize how individual consciousness transformation and collective organizing must proceed simultaneously. The recognition that the personal is political has become fundamental to approaches to social change that address cultural and psychological, as well as legal and economic dimensions of oppression. The technological implications of her work have become increasingly relevant as digital technologies create new forms of identity construction and social interaction. Her insight that identity is performed rather than given proves crucial for understanding how social media, virtual reality, and artificial intelligence affect human consciousness and social relationships. The questions she raised about authentic existence become more complex, but more urgent in environments where identity construction occurs through technological mediation rather than direct social interaction. Perhaps most importantly, her work continues to provide what it provided for her original readers: intellectual tools for people seeking to understand how their individual experience connects with broader social patterns, how personal problems might reflect political arrangements, and how individual development can contribute to collective liberation. The specific insights require updating as social conditions change, but the methodological approach remains relevant for anyone seeking to live authentically within social structures that often discourage authenticity. The ultimate legacy may be her demonstration that intellectual courage and emotional wisdom can be combined, that rigorous analysis and compassionate engagement are complementary rather than conflicting values, and that individual authenticity and social responsibility reinforce rather than undermine each other. In an era when intellectual work often becomes either abstract theorizing disconnected from practical concerns, or political activism that ignores complex theoretical questions, her achievement provides a model for how thinking and acting can be integrated in service of human liberation and dignity. The revolution of consciousness she initiated continues through the work of everyone who applies her insights to their own circumstances, while extending and modifying her analysis to address new challenges and possibilities. The transformation of identity she achieved in her own life provides evidence that such transformation is possible, while also revealing that it requires both individual courage and collective support, both personal insight and social change, both intellectual honesty and emotional commitment to human possibility. In a small apartment in Montparnasse, the desk where Simone de Beauvoir wrote The Second Sex remains exactly as she left it, covered with books, papers, and the accumulated traces of a life dedicated to understanding what it means to exist authentically in a world that provides ready-made identities for everyone, but genuine freedom for no one. The fountain pen that traced the revolutionary sentence, "One is not born, but rather becomes." A woman rests beside notebooks filled with observations about consciousness, liberation, and the endless human struggle to create meaning within circumstances that seem designed to frustrate such creation. The woman who sat at this desk for thousands of hours over 5 decades transformed herself from a dutiful bourgeois daughter into a revolutionary philosopher whose insights continue to influence how people understand identity, freedom, and social possibility. Yet her transformation was not magical metamorphosis, but the result of conscious choice, sustained effort, and the courage to follow ideas wherever they led, regardless of personal or social consequences. We will never know whether she found peace in her final moments, whether the philosophy she developed through a lifetime of questioning provided answers to the questions that had driven her investigation. The evidence suggests that she approached death as she had approached life, with intellectual honesty, emotional courage, and persistent commitment to the values that had given her existence meaning. But perhaps the question itself reveals a misunderstanding of what her work represented. Beauvoir never promised that authentic existence would be comfortable, or that liberation would eliminate suffering. Instead, she demonstrated that consciousness could maintain its integrity even under extreme pressure, that identity could be created rather than simply accepted, and that individual authenticity and social responsibility could reinforce rather than conflict with each other. The value of her achievement lies not in any final answers she provided, but in her demonstration that the questions themselves are worth pursuing. 75 years after her birth, the fundamental challenges she identified: systematic inequality, consciousness shaping social structures, the gap between human possibility and social reality persist in forms that are both similar to and different from those she analyzed. New technologies create new possibilities for authentic existence, while also creating new forms of social control. Globalization provides unprecedented opportunities for human connection, while also creating new forms of exploitation and domination. Contemporary feminism has extended her insights while also revealing their limitations and the need for ongoing theoretical development. Yet the essential insight that drove her entire intellectual journey remains as relevant as ever: that human beings are not trapped by the circumstances of their birth, but can transcend those circumstances through conscious choice and determined action, that identity is created rather than discovered, that liberation requires both individual development and collective struggle. The specific applications of these insights must be developed by each generation facing its own circumstances, but the fundamental recognition that consciousness can create its own freedom provides foundation for whatever forms liberation might take. The young woman who once sat in a provincial library reading about human possibility while feeling trapped by provincial limitations could not have imagined that her rebellion would contribute to global movements for human dignity and freedom. The student who challenged academic authorities while seeking intellectual respect could not have predicted that her insights would influence how millions of people understand their own situations and possibilities. The philosopher who questioned every established truth could not have anticipated that her questioning would provide tools for others seeking to create their own authentic existence. Perhaps this unpredictability is itself part of her legacy. Authentic existence cannot be planned in advance or reduced to simple formulas, because authenticity emerges from the creative response to whatever circumstances actually exist rather than from conformity to predetermined patterns. Each person must develop their own approach to the fundamental challenges of consciousness, freedom, and social responsibility, using whatever resources are available while creating new resources through their own efforts. The desk remains, but the work continues in countless other places as people apply insights about consciousness and liberation to their own circumstances, while extending and modifying those insights to address new challenges and possibilities. The revolution of consciousness she initiated proceeds through the daily choices of everyone who refuses to accept limiting definitions of their own possibility, who questions established authority while taking responsibility for creating alternatives, who understands that authentic existence requires both individual development and collective commitment to human dignity. The light that once illuminated her investigation continues to burn wherever people have the courage to examine their own experience critically, to challenge social arrangements that constrain human development, and to create forms of meaning that transcend the limitations imposed by birth, circumstance, and social expectation. The authentic self she constructed through conscious effort provides evidence that such construction is possible, while also revealing that it requires both personal courage and social conditions that support rather than constrain human flourishing. In this, perhaps, lies the deepest truth of her achievement, that consciousness, despite its limitations and mortality, remains capable of creating forms of beauty, meaning, and dignity that justify its existence and inspire its continuation. The woman who discovered her identity by questioning the very concept of identity created something that transcends individual existence, while remaining grounded in the particular experience of one consciousness confronting the universal challenges of human existence.